The desert had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the whisper of wind and the slow, aching beat of a man's footsteps. He moved through the brittle grass at dusk, rifle slung over one shoulder, the sky above him blushing into violet and smoke. The air carried the scent of cold dust and cedar sap, and somewhere far off, a coyote cried as if mourning something the world had already forgotten. He'd been alone so long that silence had become his company, not the kind that presses down cruel, but the kind that seeps in through your bones until you can't tell where it ends, and you begin. He hunted because it gave his hands something to do and his heart something not to feel. He'd buried too many things, family, laughter, pieces of himself, under that same red dirt. The rifle on his shoulder was the only weight that reminded him he was still here. His horse snorted, steam coiling from its nostrils as they climbed a low ridge. The land opened wide beneath him, miles of thornbrush and rock, cut through by the silver thread of a frozen creek. He scanned for movement, the faint twitch of a deer's ear, the bend of a branch. The hunger in his gut wasn't just for meat, it was for purpose. Some men hunt for food, some hunt to forget. He wasn't sure which kind he was anymore. The tracks he followed were old, faint impressions in thawing mud. Maybe mule deer, maybe gone by morning. He knelt, touched the earth, and felt how cold it still was. The sun slid behind the mountains, dragging gold light across the snowtops, then leaving them blue. He kept walking, because stopping was worse than the ache in his legs. Stopping meant remembering. As darkness gathered, he found a clearing ringed by cottonwoods, their branches shaking like thin bones in the wind. The air was heavy with stillness. Then movement, a flicker among the roots. His rifle came up before his breath even steadied. The shape was low, crawling, half hidden in shadow. Not a deer, not a wolf. He moved closer, slow, each step sinking soft into damp soil. The figure didn't flee. A faint sound came, a human breath, trembling and shallow. He crouched, lowering the barrel, and there she was, a woman. Bare as the day she was born, her body marked with dirt and bruises. Long black hair tangled with pine needles, skin burnished dark from sun and sorrow. She was curled tight beneath a fallen branch, as if trying to melt into the earth. For a long while he didn't move. The desert wind pressed through the trees, stirring the edges of her hair. Her chest rose and fell so faintly he wondered if she was still alive. He set the rifle aside, knelt closer. Her skin was cold, her lips cracked. A streak of dried blood ran down her shoulder, the wound beneath it raw and ugly. Around her ankles were faint rope burns. His gut twisted. She wasn't lost. She'd escaped. Her eyes opened suddenly, black, sharp, untrusting. He froze. For a moment, neither moved. She stared at him like a creature cornered, breath short, ready to vanish. There was no fear in her gaze, only exhaustion and defiance. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, years ago after everything had gone wrong. He spoke softly, though he knew she wouldn't understand. His voice was cracked with disuse. "You're hurt." She didn't reply, only flinched as he reached for his coat. He laid it down beside her, not touching her, letting the gesture speak for him. The fabric brushed her shoulder. She winced but didn't pull away. The night deepened. Stars came like cold fires overhead. The world around them shrank to the circle of breath and silence they shared. Somewhere an owl called, lonely, patient. He sat a few feet away, watching her breathe, unsure what to do next. She'd die if he left her there. The cold alone would take her before dawn. Yet he also knew the danger. She was Apache. If her people found her with him, he'd be the one buried by morning. But the thought of walking away burned worse than the risk. He couldn't stomach the image of her eyes closing for good in that dirt as the coyotes sang. He pulled his horse nearer, speaking softly to calm it. The animal trembled, uneasy with the scent of blood. He looked down at the woman again. Her eyelids fluttered. Her breath hitched. She was fading. He wrapped his coat around her, careful, lifting her as gently as he could. She was lighter than he expected, bones and dust. When he set her on the saddle, she sagged against him, her head resting near his chest. For a heartbeat, he felt her warmth, faint and human, pulsing against his ribs. The trail home was long and black. The moon rose pale behind thin clouds, casting silver through the cottonwoods. He rode slow, one hand holding the reins, the other steadying her. Each mile felt like crossing into another kind of life, one where duty had teeth and mercy had a price. When the cabin finally came into view, crouched by the creek like an old scar, he felt his breath loosen. Smoke from the chimney was long gone. He hadn't lit a fire in days. He carried her inside, laid her near the hearth, and stirred the embers to life. Orange light bloomed across the walls, catching on his worn tools, the rifle above the door, the small photograph on the mantel. He'd stopped looking at that photo years ago. He fetched water from a bucket, cleaned her wounds with a rag. She stirred once, murmuring something in a tongue he didn't know. The sound of it was like river water running over stones. Her eyes flickered open, caught the firelight, then closed again. When he finished, he sat across from her, elbows on knees, staring into the flames. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the strange weight of having another heartbeat in the room. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying the scent of pine smoke and frost. Inside, the fire whispered and cracked. He watched her sleep, the coat still around her shoulders, her hair falling over her face. She looked nothing like the world had told him she'd be. Not an enemy, not a threat, just a person the world had been cruel to. He leaned back, tired, eyes heavy. Somewhere between waking and sleep, he heard the wind again, whispering low through the trees. It almost sounded like words soft and knowing. "You came hunting for meat," it said, "but you found something else." The morning came slow, crawling through the cracks of the cabin walls like shy light afraid to be seen. Smoke from the dying fire curled in the air, carrying the scent of ash and wet wool. The hunter stirred from his chair, his back stiff, his breath clouding in the cold. For a moment, he forgot she was there, until he turned and saw the small rise and fall beneath his coat by the hearth. She hadn't moved much through the night. Her skin had a faint glow now, not the grey pallor it wore before. He could see her hand, small and trembling, resting near the edge of the blanket. He crouched beside her, checked the wound again. The gash along her shoulder no longer bled, though the bruises beneath it had deepened like spilled ink. When he stirred the fire back to life, she flinched at the sound. Her eyes snapped open, sharp and wild. He froze, keeping his distance. There was a long pause between them, the kind that says more than words could. He reached for the kettle, poured water into a tin cup, and set it near her without looking at her directly. She watched him through tangled hair, suspicion flickering in her gaze. When she didn't move, he took the first sip himself, then set the cup back. After a few breaths, she reached forward and drank, her hands shaking so hard the cup rattled. Outside, the creek was thawing. The sound of it filled the silence between them, like the earth itself exhaling. He cooked simple stew, deer meat, potatoes, a bit of salt, the smell spreading through the cabin. She turned her head toward it, cautious, hungry. He placed the bowl before her and stepped back again. She hesitated, then ate with small, uncertain bites. When she finished, she rested her hand briefly on the bowl's rim, as if unsure how to say thank you in a language neither of them shared. For days, this became their rhythm. He spoke little, moved quietly, worked outside splitting logs or checking traps. She stayed near the hearth, watching him through the doorway. Sometimes she helped, bringing in wood, sweeping the floor, feeding the fire. Other times she sat still for hours, staring out the window as if trying to remember where she came from. He never asked. He could tell by the scars that her story was one written in pain, rope marks on her wrists, burns along her arms, the kind of things men do when they forget that others bleed the same. One afternoon, when the wind was soft and the light golden, he found her outside by the creek. She was kneeling in the water, washing her face, her hair falling down her back like a river of night. She looked different then, not helpless, not broken, just quiet, alive. When she saw him, she didn't run. She stood still, water dripping from her fingers, and gave him a long look. Not fear, not trust, something in between. He nodded once, almost like a bow, then went back to his work. That evening, the trader arrived. Old Jasper, beard grey as dry sage, eyes always searching for something to judge. He dismounted slow, his horse blowing dust. "You keeping company now?" Jasper asked, squinting toward the doorway where she stood in shadow. The hunter didn't answer, only poured him coffee. Jasper spat. "Apache woman, ain't she? Damn fool thing to bring one of them into your home. You best be careful. They cut throats in their sleep." The hunter stared into the fire. "Maybe I'll sleep lighter then." Jasper chuckled, though it didn't sound amused. "You gone soft, friend? Out here, softness gets you killed." But the hunter said nothing, and Jasper rode off before dark, shaking his head at what he didn't understand. That night, the silence returned. thick and familiar. The woman sat on the floor near the fire, combing her hair with her fingers. He took his knife and a small block of cedar, began carving slowly, letting the rhythms steady his hands. She watched the shavings curl and fall. When he finished, he held out the small wooden comb. She blinked, hesitant, then took it. Her hand brushed his as she did. A small, accidental thing, but it felt like the first soft thaw after winter. The next day, she began humming while she worked. A low, haunting tune, full of rises and dips like wind weaving through canyons. He didn't know the words, but the melody wrapped around the room, filling every empty space with something gentle. He sat outside, listening, eyes closed. It had been years since music lived in that cabin. When he went out hunting again, he found his thoughts drifting back to her, to the way she looked at the fire as if it were teaching her something, to the way her voice could calm even the wind. He wasn't sure what it meant, or if it should mean anything at all. One evening, he returned to find her tending his wounded horse. It had scraped its leg on the rocks, and she was pressing herbs into the cut, binding it with a strip of her own dress. The animal stood still, calm beneath her hands. He stood there watching for a long moment, the world quiet, except for the sound of the creek and her soft humming. When she noticed him, she stepped back, unsure if she'd done wrong. He only nodded, saying softly, "Good." From that night onward, she no longer slept by the fire. She took to sitting by the door instead, watching the stars through the small window as if waiting for them to speak. He'd sometimes wake in the night to the sound of her whispering in her own language, soft syllables that rose and fell like prayer. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling, the ache of them, the faith buried inside grief. As the days lengthened and the snow began to melt, something unspoken settled between them. Not love, not yet, just understanding, fragile, real. He began to notice the small ways she cared for the place, the water she fetched, the logs she stacked neatly, the bread she learned to bake from watching him. One night, when the firelight was low and her face glowed gold, she looked at him and smiled. Not wide, not certain, just enough to soften the room. It struck him then how long it had been since anyone had smiled at him, not around him. He smiled back, awkwardly, the gesture foreign on his face. They said no words. They didn't need to. The quiet had become their language, one built from kindness, small gestures, and the steady warmth of shared survival. Later that night, when he lay half asleep, he heard her humming again, that same song, low and distant. Only this time her voice trembled at the end, like a held breath breaking. It wasn't sadness exactly, it was release. He turned toward the firelight, eyes open in the dark. She was still there, cross-legged by the hearth, the comb he carved glinting faintly in her hair, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost passing through his own life. The night outside stretched wide and endless, but inside that small cabin, the air felt warm. Two lost souls, each scarred by the wilderness in their own way, had found a fragile peace in the other's silence. And though neither of them would have dared to name it yet, something was beginning to grow, something tender, human, and alive, right there between the flicker of firelight and the hush of the wind. Spring crept over the land like a secret, shy and slow. The frost melted from the pine needles. The creek found its voice again, and the smell of damp earth filled the mornings. The hunter had begun to notice things he'd forgotten the world still did. The way sunlight made dust float like gold. How the air tasted different when the wind came from the south. The woman moved with more strength now. Her steps had rhythm, her hands steadier than before. She'd taken to walking along the creek each dawn, gathering herbs or watching the sky change color. Sometimes she'd bring back smooth stones or feathers and leave them on the cabin's windowsill, small offerings that meant something to her people. And somehow, to him too. He didn't ask where she'd learned the songs she hummed or what they meant. Some truths live better unspoken. He only listened, sitting by the door with his coffee, watching her in the pale light. Their lives had become a language of gestures. Her hand on his arm when dinner was ready, his quiet nod when she returned safely from the creek. No promises, no names, just the steady pulse of two souls learning how to exist near each other without fear. Once, he caught her laughing, truly laughing, when one of his chickens chased her across the yard. The sound startled him, bright and wild. something he hadn't heard in his cabin since long before the fever took everything he'd loved. He found himself smiling too, though he didn't mean to. The laugh lingered in the air long after it ended, like a prayer that finally reached heaven. But peace in the frontier never lasts long. One morning, while checking his traps deep in the woods, he found tracks in the soft earth, moccasins, not boots, fresh. The shape of them told him what he already feared. Apache, her people were near. He returned to the cabin quiet, watching her from a distance as she hung a strip of venison to dry. She noticed his stillness, the shadow in his eyes, and for the first time, he saw a flash of understanding there. She knew. That night they sat by the fire. She traced something in the dirt with a stick, a circle surrounded by marks like rays. Then she looked up at him, pointed toward the horizon. Her voice was soft. "People," she said. He nodded. The single word carried the weight of all that could come. Days passed, thick with silence. He started sleeping lighter, rifle close, ears tuned to the wind. Once, he thought he saw smoke in the distance, thin and rising. He told himself it could be traders, but his gut said otherwise. Old Jasper came through again a few nights later, his horse lathered, eyes restless. He leaned close to the doorframe, whispering like the dark could hear him. "There's men riding north," Jasper said. "White men, bounty riders. Heard tell of a runaway Apache woman fetching $50 for her capture. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The hunter's jaw tightened. "No," he said. Jasper spat into the dirt. "You'd best stay clear, friend. You start harboring one of them, you ain't no better in the law's eyes than she is." He turned his horse and left without waiting for an answer. The hunter watched him go until the dust settled. Then he went inside, heart heavy as stone. She looked at him when he entered, not afraid, but waiting. He knelt by the hearth, took her hand, and placed it over his chest. "Stay quiet," he murmured. "Whatever comes, stay down." She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. The night came thick and moonless. The forest was a sea of shadow. He sat awake by the fire, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind shift. Then, faintly, the sound of hooves. 4, maybe 5 riders. Low voices. The flicker of torchlight through the trees. He moved fast, whispering her name. Though she had never given it, he made one up for her in his heart, a sound the fire could hold. She looked at him once, eyes steady, then nodded. He lifted the trap door to the root cellar. She climbed down, silent as smoke. When the door closed, the cabin felt emptier than it ever had before. The first knock came soft, polite, the kind that hides violence behind manners. "Evening, friend," a man's voice called. "Heard tell of an Apache woman seen near these woods. You'd have caught sight of her, maybe?" The hunter stood in the doorway, rifle loose in his hand. "I ain't seen nobody but myself for weeks." The man smiled, that crooked kind of smile that smells of lies. "Mind if we look around? Orders say she's armed and dangerous." "She's half dead if she's out there," the hunter replied. "You'll find nothing here but a tired man and a cold stew." The riders dismounted anyway, torches throwing their shadows tall across the cabin walls. The leader took a step closer. "Funny thing about folks who live alone," he said. "They get to hide in things." The hunter's finger brushed the trigger. "Funny thing about men who go poking around another man's home," he answered. "Sometimes they don't walk back out." A tense breath stretched the night thin. Then came the crack of a gunshot, not his. The bullet splintered the doorframe near his head. He fired back once, hitting the torchman's arm. Screams, curses, the smell of smoke. One of them hurled a torch through the open door, and the dry wood caught like kindling soaked in sin. Flames leapt fast. The hunter coughed through the heat, eyes watering. He fired again, then stumbled as pain flared hot across his side. A bullet, grazing, but deep. The room filled with smoke. He fell against the table, clutching his ribs, and through the haze he saw the cellar door crack open. She was there, bare feet silent, knife glinting in her hand, eyes burning brighter than the fire itself. She moved like wind and fury. One of the riders reached for her. She slashed, the blade flashing. Another man fled before she even touched him, his fear louder than courage. The last one turned his gun toward her, but she was faster, throwing the knife. It caught his shoulder, spinning him down. The forest swallowed their retreat as the flames roared higher. When the silence finally returned, it was thick and trembling. She turned to him, the man who'd once hunted only for meat, now bleeding for something he couldn't name. She pressed her hands to his wound, whispering words he didn't know, voice fierce and soft all at once. He tried to speak, but the smoke caught in his throat. Her palm came to his cheek, grounding him. Her eyes, dark, deep, endless, met his. And for the first time since she came into his life, her voice broke the quiet clearly, shaped by the weight of meaning. "Stay," she said. He nodded, too weak for words. The flames took half the cabin, but the fire inside them, the one lit by something far older, far kinder, would not go out. As dawn crept over the horizon, the world smelled of ash and wet earth. The hunter lay against her shoulder, half conscious, half alive, her heartbeat steady beneath his ear. And in that small ruined place, he finally understood. He'd spent years surviving the wilderness, but it took her, fierce, wounded, unbroken, to teach him how to live. The dawn that followed was quiet as breath. Smoke hung low across the valley, curling like ghosts between the trees. The cabin still stood, half charred and trembling from the night's violence. One wall blackened, the roof sagging, the scent of burned pine clinging to every plank. Inside, the hunter stirred. His side throbbed, bandaged with torn cloth and herbs, whose smell was sharp and earthy. She sat beside him, her back to the light, grinding something in a wooden bowl. The air between them was heavy, yet peaceful in its own strange way. The kind of calm that comes after a storm, when the world forgets how to move. He tried to speak, but his voice was gravel. She turned at the sound, her hair falling loose, her hands still stained with smoke. When he reached for her, she took his hand. Not out of pity, but in quiet recognition. Two people who had walked through fire and come out the other side, scarred but still breathing. For days, she tended him. She fed him broth made from rabbit and roots, changed his bandages, sang in her low, haunting tongue. At night, she sat by the window, keeping watch with a knife across her lap, eyes flicking to the shadows outside, as if daring them to return. When he could finally stand, the world beyond the cabin had changed. The creek ran black with ash from the burnt soil. Birds had returned, cautious, their wings bright against the ruin. He leaned on the doorframe, breathing deep, letting the air sting his lungs. She stood beside him, the firelight from inside catching the edge of her face. "Your people," he said softly, pointing east. She nodded once, eyes steady. He lowered his head, unable to find the right words. "They'll come for you." The next morning proved him right. They arrived quietly. 5 figures on horseback, painted faces, bows slung across their backs. Not raiders, not bounty men. Apache, her kin. Their presence didn't feel like threat, but like something older than fear. A return. She stepped out before he could stop her. The wind lifted her hair, carrying strands of it across her face. They spoke in her language, the words flowing fast and sharp, full of memory. He couldn't understand, but he didn't need to. He could feel the pull in her voice, the ache of belonging, and the weight of leaving. One of the riders dismounted, a young man, proud and solemn. He handed her a woven blanket, turquoise threads running through it like veins of sky. She took it, fingers trembling, then looked back toward the cabin, toward him. Her gaze held him still. The silence between them filled with everything they had not said. Gratitude, sorrow, something larger than both. The young warrior gestured toward his horse, but she shook her head. Then she walked back to the hunter. Her steps were steady, deliberate, as though the earth itself was counting them. He tried to speak, but she lifted a hand and stopped him. Then she placed something in his palm, her necklace, a small turquoise stone, smooth and cool, strung on a thin cord of leather. Her eyes softened, and she pressed his hand closed around it. He felt the words she didn't say. "For what you gave, for what you became." The warriors waited. She turned and mounted her horse, the blanket flowing behind her like river water. He stood in the doorway, silent, the necklace heavy in his grasp. They rode off slowly, disappearing between the trees until all that remained was dust and the echo of hooves. He stayed there long after, the wind brushing through the open doorway, carrying faint traces of her song, the same melody she used to hum by the fire, soft and sorrowful but now distant, carried far beyond him. Time passed, weeks, maybe months, the seasons changed again, and the wound in his side faded to a scar. The cabin, though broken, still stood. He rebuilt it bit by bit, not out of duty, but because some things deserve to stand, even if only as reminders of what kindness costs and what it gives back. He no longer hunted. Instead, he carved small wooden animals, deer, fox, bird, horse, each one shaped with patience and memory. He'd place them by the creek, where the water shimmered gold at dusk. Sometimes they'd be gone the next morning, carried off by travelers or the current. He liked to think maybe her people found them. Maybe she did. When he slept, her voice came to him. The words she'd said the night the cabin burned. Stay. It no longer meant survival. It meant something deeper. Stay gentle. Stay kind. Stay human. One morning, near the edge of summer, he woke to find something on the cabin door. A single feather, tied with a thin strip of turquoise cloth. The sight froze him where he stood. He took it in his hands, feeling the soft quill against his thumb, and smiled in a way that hurt. The kind of smile that comes when grief and grace meet halfway. Outside, the sky was wide and blue. The creek sang low and constant. The mountains in the distance shone with sunlight like the edge of a dream. He sat on the porch, the feather beside him, the necklace around his wrist. The wind moved through the pines, whispering in a voice he almost recognized. Sometimes the wilderness doesn't give you what you went searching for. Sometimes it gives you something better, a chance to be the kind of person you once hoped existed. He had gone hunting for meat that cold, lonely evening long ago. But what he brought home was life. Fragile, fierce, unspoken life. And from it, he found his soul again. And when the light touched the valley just right, he could swear he saw her shape across the creek, barefoot in the grass, watching him the way the earth watches its oldest trees, silent, knowing, and forever near.